Bonjour Neuchâtel, bienvenue à la 21e édition du Neuchâtel International Fantastic Film Festival. Je m'appelle Jesper Clalois, je suis le programmateur des conférences Extended et j'ai l'énorme plaisir de pouvoir clore cette première journée de Imaging the Future, qui est donc le symposium de conférences qui est dédié à l'évolution des effets spéciaux ou des, on va dire, des technologies digitales dans la production audiovisuelle, le cinéma, les séries. Dans le cas de ce soir, de cet après-midi, j'ai le plaisir d'avoir avec nous Bram Sels, qui est donc le directeur artistique chez Access Studios, qui sont basés en Écosse et qui ont travaillé sur 3 épisodes, donc un dans chaque volume de la série Love, Death and Robots. J'imagine que si vous êtes là, vous savez de quoi il en retourne, mais je vais revenir très rapidement dessus. Donc c'est à la base conçu par Tim Miller et David Fincher, un peu des cendres de leur projet mutuel de créer un film sur Métal Hurlant, qui n'a jamais vraiment vu le jour, et puis qui s'est un peu à mesure morphé, transformé dans cette série d'anthologies dans lequel ils mandatent tout un tas de différentes boîtes d'animation pour créer des épisodes individuels qui, avec leur propre identité, des techniques différentes, mais en gardant ce ton sombrement comique un petit peu. Voilà, comme j'ai dit avant, et je le dis toujours, vous n'êtes pas venus là pour m'écouter, donc je laisse la scène à Bram Sels, dont je remercie encore une fois d'avoir accepté notre invitation, et je remercie Ian Fales, notre consultant, pour nous avoir facilité le travail pour le faire venir ici. Je vous souhaite une excellente séance et un bon festival.
Thank you. Hey. Hello everyone. Bonjour. My French is terrible, so I'm going to try and do it in English today. My name is Bram Sels. I'm an art director for Access Studios, which is a studio in Scotland, in Glasgow. I myself live in Belgium, so I should technically learn French. I should know French, but I don't. I'm sorry. I'm from the Flemish part, obviously. And I did indeed work on 3 episodes for Love, Death and Robots, which I must say it's been, for me personally, it's like one of the high points in my career, particularly being on that same sort of project, doing 3 episodes for the same IP, the same anthology, but in 3 completely different styles with 3 different directors. It's been an incredible learning experience for me, myself, as an artist, but also as an art director. I think I started at Access about 5-6 years ago as an art director. And doing these projects obviously is like, it's one of the best ways, I think, to learn the craft of being an art director, because you just work with a lot of different people, a lot of different directors, and you just start understanding a little bit about, okay, what is it that these creative people think about, what are their needs, and what is it that they're looking for. And what I want to do today is just do like a little breakdown of the designs that we did for these 3 episodes, and just look at, okay, what are the different needs for these stories, and what is it that we were thinking about when we were designing these things. Just very briefly, this is some of the work that I do. So my day-to-day job is for Access Studios, in which I'm an art director. So I design a lot of stuff for television, for games as well, for movies. But I also work for Magic the Gathering, which is a card game for which I do illustrations after my hours. Which for me personally is another reason, one of the reasons why I keep working for them as well, is that it gives me like a different perspective on, creating illustrations and creating designs, because you'll see a lot of the work that we do comes from art and comes from creating visual images that support a narrative or explain a certain need or a certain design. And obviously working for a studio or a company that develops card games and that develops and prints illustrations is a completely different thing than making designs for something that is ultimately going to be translated to a movie screen. And like I said, working for a company like that kind of forces me to keep up with the program and just to make sure that I just be my best self as an artist. But yeah, so Love, Death and Robots, like I said, it's 3 episodes that I worked on, 3 different flavors is the way that I always describe it, because it's like, you'll see in a minute, but it's 3 completely different stories, 3 completely different styles, and that was what was interesting about it. I always want to start off with like some sort of intellectual quote. This time it's like maybe a less intellectual quote, but it's one that I take to heart a lot of the times. It's one from Peter Pan, and I'll just read it for a second. "The moment you doubt whether you can fly, you cease forever to be able to do it." I think you all, for everyone who knows the story of Peter Pan, it's like it's a very important part of the story where he forgets how to fly and then he can't anymore. The reason why I wanted to use this quote today is that I feel like it's a quote that goes to the heart of what it is that we as artists, I think, try to do, and that is create something, establish like a world and a universe where people can be their best self in the story that they're living in. And I think what's important in that is that both as an artist, I feel like it's very important for myself to be able to keep some of that sort of childish creativity. I think if you lose that, it's essentially what's at the heart of each and every story, right? It's this kind of childish curiosity for things. And I feel like there's a lot of the adult quote unquote world that is trying to push back against that. And I feel like if you start losing that is where a lot of creativity gets lost. And I think that's something we really want to nurture, not only in children, but also in adults. And I feel like things like Netflix and obviously reading books is a very good way to kind of nurture that sort of field in your mind. The second reason why I wanted to put it up here is that I feel like almost 60% of the job that I do as an art director comes down to this kind of world building where we try to establish a world and a universe that the narrative requires. But it is something that what we want to do and what we constantly fight against and look for is for things in that universe that don't belong there or that are maybe misplaced there. And I feel if you, as an audience, watch some of these episodes, not only of Love, Death and Robots, but pretty much every creative IP, the worst thing that can happen is that you start thinking about what a camera is doing, or you start thinking about an actor that is maybe not acting his best, or you start thinking about maybe someone's wearing a dress that doesn't fit the scene that she's walking in. And if that happens, then whoever was responsible for that decision kind of made a sort of basic mistake. And so 60% of my job is almost just looking for that part that doesn't belong and try and reduce that. And maybe in some cases, you want to put something there that stands out, that is different. But in a lot of cases, it's that point where you break that suspension of disbelief in the audience, and that's where you kind of start losing the audience, and then they start noticing more stuff. It's the equivalent of like a grammatical error in a book, or it's like a spelling mistake. And I want to start by just talking a little bit about, I won't be too theoretical, I promise, but I want to do like a couple of sort of bullet points to kind of break down how I try to simplify my job as much as I can, because it can be very overwhelming when you start on a new project to start thinking about a lot of things, and the director comes in and they have a lot of ideas, and like this early stage in a project is very crucial and it's very fun to be in. But it can be very overwhelming, and what we try to do as much as we can is just simplify it, right? And just try to think of, okay, how can we very pragmatically start on this project, and how can we create something that just adheres to what the director's after? And so this first one, I think, is very important. Like, it's like the one thing that everyone keeps saying, right? It's form follows function. And in our case, that a lot of the times means that everything you do, everything you design can be as beautiful as you want it to be, but it's always secondary to the narrative that you're trying to tell. And the narrative, the ultimate captain of the narrative is the director, right? So, and he's trying to tell a story. And what you're trying to do with your designs is just listen to what the director wants to tell. Like, what is it that is important for him or for her in the story? And that's the stuff you wanna design around. That's the stuff you wanna push, and that's the stuff you wanna underline or distract from. And so what that means for me a lot of the times is that I try to establish the world and the rules of the world first, right? I've got two simple images here, which I think a lot of you will already know. It's an image with with two doors, obviously, but one in the style of Art Nouveau and one in the style of Art Deco. And I feel like that's a really good example because you can clearly understand what the rules are for each of these, right? And it's very easy to look at this and establish rules, right? You can start by saying that one is more geometric than the others. You can start saying that, okay, that one is more organic than the others. The use of materials is different. So there's a lot of things you can then start writing down, and that makes it very easy later on to make decisions. And so going forward on that, I start writing these things down. Like, if only for myself, I start writing these little notes for myself that I feel like, okay, how can I put into words what I think this story requires and what the story needs? And sometimes that is very, very practical stuff, like this example here from Spirited Away, in which it feels like you almost create like a graph at the bottom left there where, depending on the size and the scale of the human, you go from like these very big, overwhelming, super epic sort of structures, and then within those structures you go to medium size details and then to small size details. But the bigger shape is what is impressive, and the bigger shape is the overarching sort of structure. Now this is a bit beside the point, but that's like one of the pages I would put in a style guide. That's like one of the pages that I've got in like that world building sort of document. And then everyone that goes after that, like obviously I'm speeding through this, but we talk about this stuff, right, with the director, and then he gives his take on this, and then we talk sometimes with a client about this, how they feel about it. Sometimes when you're working from an existing IP, a lot of this stuff is already kind of, or the foundations for this are already kind of established, and you just have to write them down. But it is super helpful for everyone that comes after that, because they start understanding, like in our case, we do a lot in CG, we do a lot with 3D. So whoever's going to model that, if they're aware of this kind of rule, the simple kind of knowledge of that, they can build towards that, and they can keep that in mind while they're building it, which would then hopefully minimize the amount of feedback that we later give on it. And so, yeah, what I was saying is, it's find the odd duck. That is, like, very simply put, 60% of the job, right? You establish a lot first, obviously, and you try to create these rules, but after that, it's really just a matter of looking for, okay, what is it that stands out in this? What doesn't belong in this? And sometimes that's okay, and I think everyone's heard this mantra of you can break the rules if you know the rules, then it's okay to break them. If you don't understand the rules, it's a very bad idea to break them or to think about breaking them. And so this is the same, right? Like, if you want something to stand out and you understand what it is that you've established in your world building, then you can consciously break those decisions and you can make a point of having that stand out. But if it's not the idea that it stands out, then maybe it shouldn't. And that's, like I said, 60% of the job. It's just looking at someone's work, comparing it to what's already been established, and just being honest about, okay, this doesn't belong, or this does belong, or this is something very good, and this is something we need to maybe revise. And what helps doing that, like, if you can clearly tell, obviously, which square doesn't belong in this, and then it's easier to make a conscious decision and say, like, okay, we need to add a lot of white to this square to make it fit the rest of the image. But that's an argument you can make because you know the rules that you've set. And then it's very easy to just make that sort of call, and just to help guide the feedback, instead of saying, I don't like this pink square, but do something about it, but I don't know what it is that I want you to do about it. I can now make then a conscious decision about what it is that I want from the artist. Here's another example, which obviously you very clearly, like, we've got this sort of instinctual feeling that something doesn't belong in this lineup, and I think we can all tell what that is that doesn't belong. And because you've established rules, because you know what these kind of set rules are that you've established, you can just point at it and you can call it out as something that doesn't belong. And I think all of us, a lot of people are instinctually driven to find what the odd duck is. That is a very simple thing to do. It's something we learn in kindergarten, and it's something we learn our children to do, right? Which doesn't belong in this series of things. It's a very simple thing to do, and it makes it very simple if you've established rules. If you know what it is that you want to create, then it's very easy to do that. And that makes my job a lot easier, because then I can go in with these kind of foundations. And then after saying all that, it's also important to understand that different is not always wrong. Like that is something we try to live by a lot at Axis. And what that means is that I've shown you a lot of things just now where I can make like a grounded argument and saying like this doesn't belong in this lineup, and I can argue why it doesn't belong, and I can give feedback as to what I would do to make it belong. That being said, though, sometimes you've got something in your mind, and then you brief an artist, and an artist comes back, and he or she has done something different than what you had in mind. And then if you've set out the rules, and you can honestly look at what the artist has done, and you can think about, does this still fit the world that we're trying to establish? Then maybe it's okay that it's different from what you set out to do, right? That's where the magic happens. That's where a lot of people come into the same room and they all have these different ideas. And if you funnel them correctly, if you're just a referee to the game and you just allow people to play the way they want to play, that's where the most creative juice flows, right? That's where the most creative input comes. And this is just a simple image, right? Like sometimes I brief an artist saying like, look, I want this kind of pink room with these mint colored accents. And in my mind, that means having like a pink couch with a green carpet. But then the artist comes back and they've done the exact opposite of that. That's quite weird to see if you've got it different in your mind. Like if you're thinking about a pink couch and you get a mint green one. But that's not saying that it's wrong, right? The image on the left balances just as well as the image on the right. So maybe you could argue then that, right, maybe both of these ideas could work. And this is obviously a very straightforward idea, but it happens a lot. Right, so into the meat of it. Helping Hand is like the first episode that we did for Love, Death, and Robots. I feel like Helping Hand is maybe, I get this question a lot where people ask me what my favorite episode was, and I feel like it's maybe this one. Not necessarily for the result or necessarily for the story, but it's like the first one that we did. And I mean, there's a lot of heart of me in this. And one of the things that we learned early on while we were doing this episode is that we worked with a director who was working with this story, and this was based on a short story, so the narrative was kind of already written. And then we're trying to make this into something cinematic, into something that translates to, you know, an 8-minute episode. Now, early on, we set out to do this story into something that felt very, it was very stylized, it was very out there. And I'll show you an image of some of the first designs I did on this, where it was very funky early on. Like we were exploring what we could do with like Alex's body and how we could, you know, pull this into like a different shape that was maybe something unique. But while we were doing this, it became very clear early on that this story would suffer from making it too stylized, because ultimately when you look at this episode, it's about this girl being in space who's like constantly in view of planet Earth, but she's like at the same time, like she couldn't be further from civilization, she couldn't be further from rescue essentially in this story as well. And what makes it so gruesome and what makes it so horrible to look at is that you feel connected to this person. And it was very difficult to do in this sort of very human interactions that she has if we would do this in a very stylized way. And you'll see in a minute that we ended up with the most photoreal episode that I think maybe is part of Love, Death, and Robots. So we started doing this in a completely different mindset and a completely different idea. And what's interesting about it is you can see in a minute the side-by-side designs of our very early, you know, our early ideas and our early paths, and then what we ended up doing, which I feel like I'm convinced that it's still stronger for it because it makes it so that you're connected with her as a character more. And these are some of the very early designs that we had. We were super happy about these and we were willing to move forward with them, but yeah, you'll see in a minute. Oh, here's another page. This is just something I try to do early on as well, like just keeping, like I want to, as an artist, I try to do warm-ups as well. Like, if you don't warm up, it's like you just get into this rut. And then early on in the day, I try to do these really weird sort of paintings sometimes. In this case, we were just exploring, like I said, the female body a little bit and just seeing, okay, what can we do with this? Yeah, this is just exploration, right? Like, this is nothing concrete. This isn't me saying we need to build this exactly. It's just getting ideas out. But then slowly you start establishing these ideas, and again, like I'm talking as if these are my decisions. We're talking in a group, right? Like, there's multiple people involved, everyone with really good ideas, and you start funneling these things into something more concrete. And this is then where we started going with the proportions of Alex, which is very elongated, right? It's very stylized. It would make certain decisions later on more informed if you start from this basis, especially because we're doing a lot of animation. It's the animated version of this Alex would have been a completely different version than the version that we ended up with, which is a completely mocapped version. And then this is the version of Alex that we ended up doing, which was an actress. I forgot her name, but the likeness of the woman on the left, it looks pretty spot on to the actress that actually portrayed her. And we ended up doing this completely mocapped, and she had this bodysuit on, and like everything was just mocapped in the studio. But this is a different approach, I would say, than the previous one. And just very briefly as well about these kind of design decisions. Like on the right, you see the suit that she's wearing throughout the film, which has been, it's like this kind of hybrid between this sort of blue-collar identity of your general workman. It's like an everyday workman outfit. And then Alex, who's living in this, she's living in space, and she's essentially like this space jockey that just goes around fixing satellites for this company that doesn't care about her. And this identity of making her feel as close as you can to like a construction worker, or like, I don't know, like these people that drive to like a crane every day. That's the kind of job she needed to do. And obviously these decisions that you start to make, they're less about designing something that is looking like it would be a character out of Star Wars, right? Like, this is a character that you identify with as like a blue-collar worker. It's a completely different sort of mindset. So when you start researching this stuff, you just start looking at, okay, why do construction workers wear these stripes, right? Like, where did he go, these stripes? Why knee pads? These kind of, it speaks for itself when you start thinking about it, but that's where you start looking for or researching for references and making decisions based on that. The same with Alex, her suit, which, going back to this one, which is a lot more in this kind of diesel punk aesthetic, or whatever you want to call it. It's more based on these very early pressure suits that weren't meant to be, these aren't the spacesuits that they're using in NASA nowadays, and for good reason, but it's cool to look at, right? Like, and these were decisions early on, more based in that kind of stylized sort of diesel punk aesthetic that we were thinking more about the aesthetic almost than what it ended up being. And so these suits on the left as well, like, they're designed to the sense that I feel like we always try to strip it down a little bit to the bare minimum, but obviously a lot of research went into this, like looking at a lot of pictures from NASA and understanding why they built spacesuits the way they built spacesuits, and then taking liberties with, certain things. Here's another very early iteration on Alex. We were playing around with the idea as well of giving her a different ethnicity. And then going forward into that thinking of, okay, like, we're gonna make this really elongated female, and then just, okay, how can we push portrait proportions to make, to enhance that feeling of her being so elongated. And these are, again, just explorations, but you can see there's quite a bit of a different stylization to that right portrait than it is to that middle one. Yeah. And then this is Alex, where we, the way she ended up looking, and the helmet that I designed for it. But this helmet, again, is something that we researched quite a lot, and just seeing, it's these kind of small things, but you're constantly up in her visor, like you're constantly looking at her from close up onto that helmet. So you want to make sure that logistically it just works, right? Like it's like you're designing a helmet that needs to work, or someone somewhere is gonna call it out and say like, wait a minute, this helmet doesn't work. So you have to think about all these things and okay, what does a space helmet actually need? Like what can be on the outside of a helmet and what needs to be on the inside? Why the hell do they have these, golden visors, that kind of stuff? And it's all stuff that you don't really think about when you look at this episode, right? But it is something that I feel you're kind of obliged to do. It's your responsibility to make sure that the design makes sense. Even to the point that designing her tattoos, I think I designed like 50 tattoos in completely different styles. And then you start looking for, okay, who is she? Like, where was she born? She came from this, I don't want to say white trash, but this sort of more lower middle, maybe not even lower middle class, but at least not, she wouldn't have the most stylish designs for her tattoos. So we tried to design something that felt, a little bit trashier maybe than your average tattoo design. It's maybe a bit unfair, but still. And the same for like smaller things, right? Like the way her tank top is ripped, that kind of stuff. It's all subtle stuff that helps build the character, I think. Oh, let's go back a second. And then a big part of the show as well was the anthem, which was the name for her spacecraft, which we designed early on, and again in the sense that we wanted to create this very brutalistic sort of diesel punk aesthetic where it's a raw machine flying through outer space, right? This isn't taken into account the way that NASA would design a spacecraft, right? There's a whole lot of reasons why NASA wouldn't build it the way that we've built it here. And then we ended up with something that felt a lot more practical and something that you would consider NASA to be building. And Yannick Cowan, who was a concept designer on this, he's just done a phenomenal job. Like he's this tech whiz as well. Like he understands a lot of this technology very deeply, and he understands why windows need to be round in outer space, like that kind of very deep thinking. And he just understands what needs to be on even the most basic of spacecrafts. And then what we wanted that thing to feel like was that it's like the equivalent of her trucker van in outer space, right? This is where she lives, this is where she works, she's constantly in this thing. It's like a delivery van, right? You barely have any space in there to turn around. And we ended up with this version early on, which was, the first thing we heard when talking to the directors about this was that it was just way too big, right? Like it was too luxurious. Even though it looks like a very crude machine, it still felt too big for her. Like we wanted to condense it down to the point that you would almost feel claustrophobic inside of it. And in the story, that you have to watch the story a little bit to understand why that works better and why that makes sense in there. But then you start thinking also about the inside, like what do we need to put in the inside? And this is a very early iteration of the anthem where we were still thinking about like, okay, maybe she has a guitar in there. Like if she lives in here for maybe a year or so, like she's probably has got a lot of memorabilia and stuff like that collected. Maybe she has a carpet bolted to the floor. Which again, in the second state of the project, we slimmed it down quite a lot and we just made it a lot more practical. I think what we narrowed it down to were these little Post-it notes and the stuff in the foreground, like the hula dancer, and there's some ribbons as well on there. There's even a picture of my cat somewhere in there. But it was very, it's very Spartan, right? Like it's just her delivery van that she got from work. Maybe she needs to switch it every now and then with another company worker. But it's to the point that everything in that thing is broken. Like everything is scratched, everything is dinged up. Like half the machinery doesn't work the first time you boot it up. And it's like this kind of, what we wanted to get is this thing where you felt like this would be really annoying to work in this, like you're this worker in outer space and it's just you're working for the shittiest of shitty companies and they really don't care about you. They really don't care that whatever system you're using isn't working. And there's remnants of that thinking all over this place. Like like I said, the Post-it notes, they're all handwritten and they all say something that makes sense to whatever thing they're attached to. You never really see them in the story. You kind of almost have to freeze frame and zoom in on them to read what's on them. But at the same time, it helps to add life to it. Even if there's only one person in the world that looks at what's written on these notes, it makes sense to the story, and it helps build something that, in this narrative, supports the idea from the director. Then the satellite that she's working on, again, like a very early iteration of this, where, like, if you look at the upper left corner, there's Alex. It's like this massive thing, right? Like, it's this company has like 20 million of these satellites, and she's working just on one of them. But again, that felt like it's a very nice design. I feel like this is still a very strong satellite design, I think. But it didn't work for our story in the sense that we wanted this thing to feel smaller, like she's just going to fix maybe the equivalent of like a windmill in outer space or something, right? Not, this isn't the Star Trek Enterprise. It's like this thing that company just has a million of, right? There's a number on it, like 137, indicating that there's maybe 136 more at least, right? So making this design also as practical as we could with like, okay, what would that satellite look like? How would we design it so that it looks like something that we would all believe would be a satellite? And then at the same time also making it feel very much like it doesn't have a personality, right? The more personality you kind of project onto this thing, the less strong it becomes for our story, because it makes it almost more about the satellite. Whereas we wanted this thing to feel like it's not about the satellite. Like there's a million more of these, right? It's really just another day on the job. And then I often do a lot of keyframes as well. Like what I showed you just now were the early designs. And then eventually, again, we talk about these designs a lot, and then of course you make decisions and you say like, yeah, this is it. We move forward with these designs, and then we do production design for it. We make like blueprints for the artists to work on. But what I start doing after a while, after we've established the world a little bit, I start doing these small keyframes where I try to paint what I think we would see through the camera. And sometimes this is, when talking to layout or when talking to even the storyboard artists early on, what it is that they've drawn and then painting on top of that, or just trying to do something myself. But for this story where we ended up with Alex is this kind of, again, it's about Alex, right? She's the character about, of which the story is about, and we follow her and her ordeal. And it's very harrowing. It's a very intense sort of tale. But we're very close to her a lot of the times, and we see things from her perspective. And I wanted this thing to feel, again, like we're very close to these things. Like this isn't early on in the early iteration of this, we had this idea of making these very tremendous movements, and the early sketches that you saw, like the female body was really pushed to the extreme, and we did this really impossible movement in animation. But in this version of it, it's all very close, right? Like it's very claustrophobic and it's all very close together. Whereas at the same time, again, if you watch the story, it's all about her not being able to get back to something that is so close within reach. And I feel like this was one of the keyframes that kind of summed that up very good. Like it felt like something you could almost reach to and grab, but you can't. And that's the frustrating part for her in this story. And here's a bunch more. Like I said, I try to do as much of these as I can. I feel like they inform what these early on, like I try to do some of these early on as well. Like I feel like what it helps doing very early on is it gets everyone on the same page. It's very easy to look at some of these images and understand what the final look is gonna be. Like this is something that, as close as I can get it to look like the final piece in Photoshop, I try to get it as close to that as I can. And obviously, I mean, I don't want to spend like 2 days on each of these panels, so some of these are just paintings that took an hour or two. But the idea is that you just photo bash things together very quickly so that you can show this to a client or you can show this to the director, and that gives them an immediate insight into, oh, this is what it's going to look like. And then their immediate response is either, no, this isn't it, or this is great, keep doing this. And that, again, helps everyone just to get everyone on the same page, and so that everyone understands what it is that we're making and what it is that we're building. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff in here, right? Like there's effects in there as well. There's some motion graphics in there. So there's just a lot of information that other departments can look at and say like, oh, this is going to take so much time and this is going to take, they can immediately raise the alarm if there's like 20 explosions that they didn't plan for. Yeah. So here's some more. There's going to be a couple spoilers in this, so I hope everyone has seen it or at least can deal with spoilers. But yeah, these are super informative, I think, for the teams. Cool. So the second episode was a tall grass, which was a completely different beast. It was something that was made by a director who's actually from Switzerland, Simon Otto. He directed this episode. It was great to work with him. I remember when we started on this, we had we pretty much knew what we wanted to do very early on this. Like Simon is like a ridiculously good draftsman, and he made this complete storyboard reel, like the animatic for this very early on. Like he just drew everything himself. It was incredible, and he just sent it over, and like immediately you could understand his kind of vision on this and like where he wanted to take it. And it's this very eerie story, a very kind of Lovecraftian story. But it was like a treasure trove, that sort of early animatic, because again, it's very crucial that everyone involved is on the same page early on. And these things help speed that up. Like everyone can look at it and say, "Whoa, this is great. Like I understand what it is we're making." And so for the tall grass, that was very useful. And one of the things, I'll show you this kind of small breakdown very quickly. What we set out to do on this was we wanted to create something that, I'll play it again, if I can. Where our original sort of mantra on this was that we wanted to create something with every frame a painting, was what we kept saying, and the idea was that we wanted people to be able to freeze frame on any frame in this episode and look at it as if it was a painting. And so we tried to create something. We still wanted to do it in 3D, like this is a fully CG pipeline, and we wanted to create something that felt in 3D like it was painted. And for this, we created like very early on, we started exploring a little bit with what that could mean, right? Because what I feel like always happens in CG is that these kind of shadows are probably the area where you mostly see through the cracks. And so we wanted to create something with very graphic shadows, but at the same time also allowing for, the form sculpting aspect of those shadows, right? And we started playing with these texture maps that we applied. You can see it's very clearly actually, like it's missing from the bottom half of him, and then the top part kind of has that idea applied. This is just me in Blender very early on trying some stuff, but the idea there was that it's in that transition that we break it down, and that's where we apply like these sort of sketchy brush strokes, and we didn't use these kind of cross hatches, but you'll see it in the second breakdown as well, how that works. This is another version that we played around with, like this really gritty sort of, I don't know, like noisy pattern. It's not something we ended up doing, but I'm just showing this to show what it is that we explored on this. Here's another breakdown where I feel like in action you can kind of see, this again isn't the shadow map that we ended up using, but it's a very early experiment in just seeing like, okay, how can we have an animated character move without it feeling too much like it's like a CG, with like a very Gaussian sort of transition in the shadows. Here's another very early experiment I did with Blender, which is just trying to project textures onto very simple geometry where the textures are very painted, and then we tried to build a scene with, just flat textures essentially, right? Just painting this and then trying to keep some of the seats in 3D and seeing how far we could take that without it, before it started breaking essentially. We ended up doing something a little bit different where I think this is the kind of approach that we still kept using for the grass, because grass is just it's very time consuming to otherwise paint. But what we ended up doing is just every background is just a painting, quite literally. So I'll show some of those in a second as well. But yeah, in this train that was very easy to do. Like this train is one of the, I feel like it's almost a character in and of itself, right? This train establishes the mood very early on, and the design of the train was very important for us to nail that down to something that felt like it was appropriate in the time that the story takes place. But also at the same time felt very brooding, like it's a very, this is just pure machinery, right? Like this doesn't have any heart in it. It feels almost like a haunted train, right? Which was essentially the idea. And in doing that, like what I often do as well is just doing like a design like this, and then okay, what can I do to the colors of this same image? Let's see what comes out of the back end of that, and talking again to a lot of people about this, where I feel like we toned it down a little bit in the final episode, but the very first image there was something everyone really loved in this kind of very unreal sort of green atmosphere with the red windows, which is kind of that sort of complementary color scheme worked very well. Eventually we turned it down because we felt it was too distracting from the story that we were trying to tell. So it's again thinking about story and making decisions based on that. Here's another keyframe I tried to do for that. And then the character designs as well, which in a case like this, I find it a little bit easier for us to create character designs. We didn't have a lot of problems with these two, because essentially it's a period piece as well. Like you just research the period and you just look at, okay, really in depth. Like again, we had Yannick on this, who was researching the train to like insane detail. But in our minds, the story took place, we didn't want to set like a specific place for it, but it was kind of in the American Midwest somewhere, not specifically a certain area. And based on that, you just start looking, okay, what trains drove around in that area and in that time? What were people wearing at that time in that place? And you just find a lot of research, and you just dig into that, and that's where you make your decisions. And then this is, sorry, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but this is kind of what we set out to do, where the top one is the keyframe I painted for it, and then the bottom one is the final image. That's a frame from the film. And if you look at the background, that is just, there's geometry there, but we painted over it. Like this is a complete painting. And then the character itself, I feel like that's one of the things I loved a lot about this project, seeing that come together and kind of, we did a vertical slice, so we were reassured in the fact that it would work, but still seeing both of them come together and feeling like they belong in the same world, that was crucial. Here's another one. The grass, on the other hand, was a very difficult thing to get right. It's very easy to paint grass, and it's very easy to paint it very impressionistic, like in the top image there, but obviously in 3D you're dealing with something that you either need to project on or you need to keep it a flat image. But when this guy is running around in it, there's no way that you can keep it a flat image. So you have to deal with grass essentially in 3D that you want to make feel painterly, and that took a lot of time, especially in this shot where the camera's like rotating around. It was incredibly difficult, but I feel like we ended up with something that worked really well. Here's another painting of this. Richard Wright, an illustrator, worked on this a lot, and he's just an incredible painter, and he did a lot of this work as well. Again, we followed the geometry of the place, so it was like we had a really good solid base to start from. But what he added to this just makes it feel like it's maybe a little bit hard to see on the projector, but if you go to my art station, some of these are on there, and you can zoom in on the detail. It's just incredible the way he paints. Here's another one. This is one I did. It was just really fun. Like these were like, I don't know, a couple of weeks of really hardcore painting and then just getting all these frames out. But it was fun, kind of like sprinting a marathon a little bit. Here's another one. This was also incredibly difficult. Like this, really fun, like painting this kind of machinery, but then obviously the machinery needs to move and then there's effects that comes on top of this. The effects is another thing we played around with a little bit, like how we could make smoke feel painterly, that kind of stuff. And then a color script, which is not unlike what I was showing just now with Help in Hand. It's the kind of thing I started doing early on. I think that image at the top there, the second one, is one that I think painted very early on this project, and it helped so much in just getting everyone to think about this thing in the same way. I feel like a lot of this like isn't on my resume. I must say, like it's like influenced from Simon Otto and from other people involved to have like creative ideas, and you just start funneling these, and I just feel like I'm just combining all these ideas into something that I think looks cool. But yeah, like in the case of the tall grass, I think what we also wanted to do was tell this story in the way Simon kind of directed it, was that it takes place over I think 8 minutes or something, and we wanted to build it up like very slowly. And this early stage of the tall grass felt like before he goes into the grass, like maybe the first half that he's into the grass as well, but we still wanted to keep it as eerie as we could. Like we wanted to start this film with everyone uneasy about the colors that were used, and like a little bit on the edge of their seat already without knowing what's going to happen. And I think working with these colors helps a lot in that. There's, I think, another page, where eventually, like if you go, I'll go back to the previous one, we start on this very eerie sort of complementary green-red, uneasy feeling color scheme, and it just becomes darker and grimmer and more, once he steps out of the train, it becomes foggy and it becomes like, it's just very uneasy. And then he goes into the grass, and then it's like, there's a couple seconds where he's kind of comfortable, and then it all goes haywire, right? And he kind of meets these creatures, and from then on out, it just becomes this insane sort of chase through the grass. But from then on out, it's almost like an action movie, right? But up until that point, you build to this kind of dreaded sort of reveal of the creature, and then it's just a chase scene. And then we wanted to, be very aggressive with the colors at the very end of it as well, where like all of a sudden it just becomes completely red, right? And that's the part where, the railman comes to rescue him. And I feel like that if you look at it, the whole color script on like one page, there's like this really cool narrative in the colors that are used, and that again is something that is done very purposefully to enhance the feeling that the director wanted to get across with his narrative. And then the last episode already is Mason's Rats. This is from the latest season that just came out, I think 2 months ago, something. Completely different project again, but also a very, very fun one to work on. The kind of rule set that we had for this project was that we wanted to do something. It's like a little bit of a goofy sort of episode, like it's the comedic note, I think, maybe in the season a little bit. It still has like heart in it, and it's not comedy for the sake of comedy. Like there's some logic to it. But it's very aggressive. It's very bloody. But at the heart of the story is this kind of old guy who just like Carlos, who directed this, Carlos Stevens, he always described this as like, it's really a story about like an old guy who doesn't understand this new iPhone. Like that's the kind of feeling we wanted to go for. So this whole story is like filled with like this old guy on his farm that he can't go along with the technology and how fast it is evolving. And these rats obviously are like the victim of that, that sort of idea. But what we wanted to do early on as well is that, I'll show some pictures while I'm talking. But we wanted to just go, we wanted to go bloody, and that's something we knew from the very first day that we worked on this. Like this was a bloody story. We wanted to go, these rats are like essentially like blood bags that explode all over the place. And that sort of aggressiveness, that kind of in-your-face kind of aggression, that is ultimately what is the comedy of it, but it's also what makes it so kind of hard to watch, right? And that's ultimately what that, the guy just comes to his senses at some point, and then he deals with the repercussions of that. But the way we designed it as well is that we stylized the hell out of these characters as well, because we wanted this to feel insane, and we wanted it to feel over the top. And it's like this guy has like these big massive farmer hands, and then the other guy, the suit that comes in, is like this really sleazy guy that almost looks like a weasel. Like it's like caricature to the extreme. Like we wanted to push that idea of it, like create this world that, in complete contrast to the very first episode I was showing, shows just how over the top this whole story is, and what this guy is going through. Whereas the first story is this really intimate story where you follow one character. This is another keyframe I did for that early on when we were still like Mason is this guy. In a very early version of Mason, I think I have some images later in this, but in a very early version of Mason, we were designing him in a way like in the story, he's just a farmer, right? There's no real, or in our version of the script at least, there was no real world building attached to the fact that he's a farmer. So it's to the point that he's a farmer and he lives on his farmland. But we wanted to tell a story about a guy that is more than just that farmer, right? Like the more kind of, and again, this is important to note that as soon as you add something to the mix that distracts from the heart of the story, then that's the wrong decision. But what we did want to do is, without being intrusive, we wanted to create a character that people could relate to. And in our world, that meant being specific with who he was and where his farm was located. So we created this kind of Scottish farmer where he's like living somewhere in the Highlands with his super technology-driven barn. And that felt like once we made that decision to make him Scottish, a lot of decisions after that were informed by that one small decision to make him Scottish, quote unquote. Like even to the point that the soundtrack has like these bagpipes in the background and stuff like that. It's like, it's all building. We also didn't want to create Groundskeeper Willie or something, right? Like we wanted to create a true character where we felt like we had respect for the culture that, was behind him and not just a caricature of one. And yeah, that's where we ended up with this guy that was just a Scottish farmer. And then you start thinking about, okay, Scottish farmers, like what do we do with that? Here's another very early version of him where there was a stage where we wanted to make it a little bit more colorful. We ended up with something that I think is quite cool and quite unique, where it's these super highly stylized characters, but they're living in this world that is very photoreal, and the textures that we see are photoreal. This early version of that was still a little bit more colorful maybe, and we wanted to be a little bit more extreme maybe with the stylization of textures and even light. But it was still a very, very crucial image just to get everyone again aligned on what it is that we're building. Even to the point of like if you look at the episode on Netflix, these characters, the heart of both of these characters is in this one image. Like you could look at this image and you can understand who these two characters are. You can even understand to a degree what's going to happen to the rats. But it's like about these two characters that are polar opposites of one another, right? And I wouldn't say that one of them on this image is specifically likable, but they are polar opposites of like this idea of technology. And that is again something, if you look at this and you talk about this kind of stuff and you talk about these ideas of, okay, these characters, we want to juxtapose them against each other, you start making more informed decisions again. Like the way he has his name tag glowing, like he's like the pinnacle of like technology, right? Like he's the newest cell phone, whereas Mason has like the oldest cell phone, and it's this kind of divide that is at the heart of this as well. Even to the point that, but this is something you don't really see if you don't pay attention to it, but like the magnifying glass, all that kind of stuff, if you look at the designs of these, they're all very, there's always like it's a little bit too sci-fi, the stuff that he's using, and then the stuff that Mason's using is like just very analog and very old school. even his kitchen, right? Like we had a very early idea where we had like these pink curtains in the back, as a remnant of his wife that passed away. But that again just became too distracting. Like we didn't have time in 8 minutes to also tell the backstory of his wife. It's a little bit unfortunate, but yeah. And these are early iterations on. I wanted to show this because these are the very early iterations of Mason, where I feel like if you look at this, I still like some of these designs that I did for that, but I can't say for any of these characters, maybe the one, number 6 there, is leaning closest to where we ended up going, but I can't say that any one of these has the same heart as the character that we ended up creating. Like I feel like these are generic farmers. And more importantly, there's already a farmer in one of the Love, Death, and Robots episodes that looks like he could be on this lineup. And I feel like then you just create something that already exists or that maybe doesn't fit the story that you try to tell. But it's good still to do 12 versions of this, just to know that this isn't what you want. Especially that number 10 guy, the Willie Nelson one, that is like, we just knew, okay, like we probably don't want to create like another American farmer, so we want to do something else. I keep pointing this thing at this, but it's not. Like, and these are 2 early versions. Like, I feel like the number 2? I still see like a version of the story with this guy. I don't know, but he's just very white trash, right? Like, I don't know. But there's a lot of decisions. We were trying stuff out and just being a bit ridiculous with it. Like the way he has this crooked nose on 12, or the way he has like this kind of plasticine nose that's stuck on top. I think what is so fun about doing these Love, Death, and Robots episodes is that no one comes in saying, yeah, you can't do that, like you have to do this and this and this. You just do it, and then you talk about it, and it turns out it doesn't work, which is fine. But it might have worked, like there's maybe another world with another story that could have used some character like that. The fun thing is you don't know until you see it, and then you talk about it, and sometimes it doesn't work. And then this is the right, left version, are 2 versions of just very early concepts, but the right one is the one that is closest, I think, to where we ended up. He's a little bit older, I feel, in the final episode. And then the rats themselves, these were super fun to design as well. I think early on, we designed a whole lot of different shapes for them. We ended up just using 2 of them. And then we also felt like it would be more to the heart of the story if a lot of these rats looked more alike, so that it's more like their cannon fodder. And then we ended up in a situation where we only wanted like the lead rat, which is the second guy there, to be the one that stood out. And then we just created like one other archetype of a rat, and we, slimmed him down a little bit and inflated him a little bit just to make some difference. We obviously created different fur colors as well, but we wanted people to be able to look at these rats. And it's like when you're looking at rats, right? You can't differentiate different rats unless maybe they're your pet. And these ones were just too different. We like the designs of these a lot, but it's just a practical thing sometimes as well. Like if you would have this kind of fat rat, he would stand out so much that you would see duplicates of him running around all over the place. So sometimes you have to just be practical as well. Susan, the cat. I think this is one of the funnest characters I think I've designed in the whole series, especially because this cat was always like, he was like a he's like a sort of back note to the story a little bit. I mean, he drives the story forward, so he's a needed character, but he's not an important character. But he kind of started creating his own like identity, and then she ended up getting a name like Susan. I think originally she was called different, but then I forgot who the voice did for Mason. He just came in and he did his audition, and he just yelled out Susan, which was super funny, and then we ended up naming her that. And these are the fur colors that we tried. The farm as well, like this is I think, I didn't do this design, but I think it's a really good design. It fits the story, it feels overwhelming, it's that same idea of just being over the top with technology. You see, if you look at the story, like this is older technology than the technology that the suit is gonna introduce. And that was important to us as well, to get, even this thing is already over the top for him, but it's different from the technology that the suit introduces. And then I did some lighting passes on this, just trying out different skies and just seeing, okay, what is it that, we wanted this to feel like a typical day in the Highlands, sort of say, and we wanted to make it feel impressive, not to the point that the sky would distract from the story. So something like, 8, is a little bit too fiery, maybe, for the tone of the story that we wanted to set. It makes more sense, I think, towards the end of the story, where you want this kind of golden hour, conclusion to the story. The kitchen here as well, was always a fan of this design. Yeah, there's a lot of technology, again, kind of just pasted on the wall very willy-nilly, or how do you say that? With just cables draping around this place. Like, he isn't the guy that knows how to deal with this stuff, so he just screws it in the wall and, he hangs the cable. And then I'm gonna fly through this a little bit, but there's the Scorpion that comes out, the TT-15. A design that we did for this one as well, where we started thinking about, okay, how would this thing animate with just this kind of very simple LED face on him? I don't know, is that not showing right? I think, is that just the angle? It should light up. It doesn't look like it's doing that here, but yeah, and that was it. I think I'm just right on time. Sorry, I sped through this last part. I hope that was a little bit interesting. I wanna say, if there's any questions, then I'd be more than happy to answer them. I can hardly see. Thank you. Is there any questions? Yeah, go for it.
Wait for the mic. Thanks. Hi.
Hey.
Thanks for the talk. I have to say first that I haven't seen any of your episodes or any
I hope I
Love,
didn't
Death
spoil
and
them.
Robots. But at the very beginning of your talk, you said that form follows function in your way to work with the things. And when you talked about it, you implied that the function that the form should follow was the story and how it was, what should be told. But throughout your experience of the directors you work with or anything, is there sometimes that the story wasn't quite as central? Maybe it was something else like cinematography or anything that has to be untouched, and even the story or anything else could maybe change to fit that center experience?
Yeah, that sometimes happens, yeah. I feel like as long as you design with this principle in mind, you rarely run into situations where that's the case. Like, more often, it's when I do these very early explorations, when certain things aren't established yet, that you could sort of tic-tac on these ideas, and then directors could use these as like a jumping off point to introduce a new idea sometimes. But very often, and especially in the case of Love, Death and Robots, we work from short stories that are already kind of established. On other projects, it's sometimes more difficult, particularly when you're working with clients that have already established their world. And in a lot of cases, and I think you probably all understand that being here on this festival, but the strongest stories are the stories that take this kind of principle in mind. Whereas for me, at least, I think a lot of people will agree, is that the less than strong stories are the stories that just want to have explosions and just showcase things for the sake of showcasing them. Sometimes people design just for the cool factor and not for what it needs to do in the story. I think my tendency is to be a little bit minimalistic when it comes to designing. Like I'll always question, do we need to design it in the first place, right? If there's like something, like an existing kind of thing that we can use, then maybe that's the better option. That doesn't mean that we don't design. Obviously, we design a lot of stuff, but it's always harder, I would say, when like a stakeholder or someone from higher up is like, can we make the gun 20% bigger, that kind of stuff. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to the story and you just end up doing it because, I mean, there's higher ups. That's just the way of the game. But that luckily isn't very often. Like I feel like in most cases when a story is told the right way, no one's going to question the design that you've done. And then I feel like it's going back to that quote I showed at the beginning, right? Like if you can make people forget that they're even watching an animated story, no one's going to question like the worst of the shots or the worst of the designs. Like they're just so involved with the story that they're forgetting about all that other stuff. And that makes everyone's life easier, I think, yeah.
Hi. How much should time made this episode, and how much people work on it?
That's hard to say. I think probably 8 to 10 months that we worked on each of these. And in terms of the size of the team, that's really hard to say. I think there's probably about 100 people involved in each of these, but not. I mean, departments don't always overlap, so it's like over the time span of this whole creation from production to, you know, groom artists or whatever, there's probably 100 people involved, yeah. Maybe more.
For this kind of style, what's the pipeline? You have the 3D and after the compositing, how it works, and which software you use?
We usually, I mean, it's not really my jurisdiction, so I'm probably not the right person to answer this question, but I think we have a fairly traditional pipeline. So in my experience, at least, from my point of view, we have a short few weeks where we try to, you know, to design all the stuff where it's pre-production a little bit, and then it's pretty traditional in the sense that assets comes in, they create a 3D version of it, then texturing, then rigging, animation. It's like the classic, I would say, the classic sort of pipeline in that. And then we end with what we call at Axis LRC, which is lighting, rendering, compositing, which is not until too long ago was one department, like it still kind of is, but it was one department that took care of all that. And that's like the last half almost of the project. That usually overlaps a little bit with animation as well. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation and the 3 shorts. It was very good. I was wondering if you take account the budget of the certain shots you produce in the early stage of the production, or you let your ideas develops and cuts after for the release.
Yeah. That comes into play a lot. Actually, I feel like I kind of thrive, I think, a little bit on having a set budget. It makes it so that you've got a very you've got boundaries, right? Like this is the size of the playground that you get, and then you try to maximize what's inside of that. I feel like when you have the endless budgets of some of the bigger Hollywood movies, it makes it so that you get a lot of wasted effort, which isn't always, it's not always good for motivation, but it's also not good, I think, in a way that setting limits for yourself makes it so that you have to play by certain rules, and it I don't know, for me it's almost like a safety blanket where you just design within something that you feel could match the budget. Now, very early on, we always do like storyboards, and that's where a lot of these questions arise, right? Like you see where there's meant to be an explosion or where there's meant to be, and then all these departments get eyes on those storyboards, and they they make an estimate of, like, for our department, this is going to cost X amount of days, and for our department, this is going to cost X amount of days. And then you try to obviously, you know, there's always a bucket of days that we try to use for, these things always grow, right? So, but yeah, that helps a lot, I feel. And to a degree, I feel like I love watching indie movies as well, because they deal with these same kind of questions, and you just, I don't know, sometimes a story just becomes stronger if you limit it to its bare essence, right? Because you can't overbloat it, because you just don't have the money to overbloat it. And I feel like a lot of times, in our case especially, it's also just a time-driven thing, right? In the case of Love, Death, and Robots, there's just a very real deadline to this, where it just has to go live on Netflix. So there's only until that point where you can go, you know, like sometimes it's not even about budget, it's about, okay, how can we get this done actually, right? How can we render the shots in time, or do we have enough animators to animate, you know, the amount of minutes that we've got, to the point that obviously you never want to sacrifice quality, I think, for the sake of, or at least you want to try and minimize that. Sometimes it does happen a little bit. But it's the same in design, right? Like, I feel like if I design something where I get the feeling that the departments later on aren't 100% comfortable to get it done within the time that they have, then I feel like I would much rather slim down the design and do a stronger execution of a slimmer design than doing a bigger design that is less than, you know, perfectly executed. So it's a little bit of a give and take, and you often have to guess a little bit, because you make these decisions sometimes early on, and then things change, and it's very organic. So sometimes, you know, that works out. Sometimes you have to deal with certain curveballs. But yeah, like I said, I feel like I've never been in a situation where we couldn't deal with those curveballs. If you plan accordingly, like if you don't try to overbloat things that don't need it, then you're usually safe down the line. Yeah. Cool.
So thank you very much, everyone,
thank you.
for being here. We can thank our speaker.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions later, I'll be around. Just come and say hi. You can also email me if you want, or send an email to recruitment if you're looking for a job. We're constantly hiring, and like we're hiring everyone, so just send an email. Cool. See you all.